Hi everybody, and welcome to Chapter 8. In Chapter 8, we are going to be focusing on the eating disorders and sleep-wake disorders. I want to start with eating disorders and go through the major different types of eating disorders. We've seen a noteworthy increase in eating disorders since the 1960s. A lot of this is culturally driven in addition to being a mental illness. Beauty is culturally defined. There is no such thing as inherent beauty, and the definition of beauty changes over time. In the 1950s and 60s, the definition of beauty for women was a much fuller, curvier figure, and then the definition of beauty changed after several decades to a much thinner body, which is likely why we've seen a massive increase in eating disorders since the 1960s, because our cultural definition of beauty has shifted. Want to talk about the major different types of eating disorders that people use to try and meet that cultural definition of beauty. The first is bulimia nervosa, which is binge eating. It's not just binge eating, it's binge eating, and it's coupled with feelings of being out of control, that you can't stop eating, you can't stop the desire to eat. And the binging is always followed by some sort of purging of the food. So the purging can be vomiting, it can be excessive use of laxatives or diuretics, it can be excessive use of exercise, and when I say excessive, I'm talking 2-3 hours a day of exercise, burning 1,500-1,600 calories a day to purge that binge. There's also a binge eating disorder, and this is when an individual binge eats repeatedly, but they do not purge, right? But they experience serious distress as a result of the binging. So it starts with, binge eating disorder usually starts with dieting, where somebody goes in and they restrict their diet to try and lose weight, and that restriction is just too hard to maintain. They're desiring food the whole time, and boom, they binge eat because they've been restricting so severely. Or they've been dieting, they've been binge eating and they feel the need to diet after the binge eating is usually typically how this disorder starts. Interestingly, this is the one eating disorder that is more common in men than in women. Women vastly dominate the eating disorder issue. It does not mean that men are not a part of it. They absolutely are, but usually they are a much smaller part of it. But for whatever reason, binge eating disorder is more a male-focused disease than a female-focused disease, which is out of the norm for eating disorders. The next is anorexia nervosa, which is eating minimal amounts of food while simultaneously exercising to the extreme to lose weight. Right. Anorexia nervosa often starts out as basic dieting and it spirals out of control over time. Right. Anorexics are often extraordinarily thin, dangerously thin, abnormally thin. They look as though their body is in starvation because it is in a state of starvation, and it often results in dangerously low weight levels. 20% of all anorexics die of this disorder. There's a myriad of things that happen when you start starving your body, or you just maintain such a small amount of food that your body doesn't receive adequate nutrition or adequate caloric intake. The body will start essentially eating itself. It will start attacking the fat tissue, and once the fat tissue is gone, it will begin to attack the muscle tissue. One of the big problems there is that our heart is a muscle, and the body's not being fed, and the body starts to digest itself, so to speak, and there's just too much strain and not enough restoration of nutrients. And heart failure is common. They literally die of starvation, right? In addition, it's such a stressful disorder, there is a large proportion of anorexics that end up committing suicide. 20% of all people who die of anorexia die as a result of taking their own life because the disorder is just so overwhelming. So it's a very serious thing. There's a lot of commonalities between all eating disorders. There's differences. So anorexics tend to be very open about their weight loss. They tend to flaunt their weight loss, wear skimpy clothing, be very proud of their excessive exercise, whereas bulimics are much more secretive about the way in which they're purging, obviously, and the weight loss. They tend to try and hide the weight loss by wearing bulkier clothing, so people don't notice that there's something going on with their purging. So that's very, very different, but they are common. They have a lot of commonalities. So the first and foremost commonality between all of these eating disorders is the excessive abnormal desire to be thin. There's cultural pressure on all of us to be thin and beautiful. I think everybody wants to fall into that category in some capacity, but for people suffering from eating disorders, it's an abnormal obsession. It goes beyond the regular cultural pressure that the rest of us feel. Self-esteem for these people are largely determined by weight and appearance. So they might be incredibly successful in other areas of life, be it school, work, sports, whatever. But none of that builds self-esteem. None of that matters because it's all negated by their perception of what they look like and the idea that what I look like doesn't look good enough or it's not beautiful enough. And therefore, how they look and how they feel about how they look dictates their level of self-esteem, which is often very, very low. Right? They have all of them have an irrational fear of out of control eating. That this idea that once I start eating, I am not going to be able to stop. My body will never feel full, and it'll get out of control, and I'll just pile on the weight, and I'll spiral out of control. So there's an excessive fear of out of control eating that will result in weight gain and obesity. Right? Medical consequences of purging are several. So for people who purge, regardless of it depends on what way they're purging. If the purge method of choice is vomiting, we're going to see enlarged salivary glands. We're going to see destruction of the esophagus because those stomach acids are repeatedly coming up forcefully and eroding the esophageal lining. We're going to see the people who do this, their teeth and gums will start to erode as well. Again, that stomach acid is meant to stay in the stomach for digestion. Our teeth and our gums aren't meant for common exposure. It's totally one thing if you get sick, you have the flu, you throw up a few times, it's not going to cause any damage. But if you're purging with vomiting on a regular basis and you're exposing those parts of your body to the stomach acids on a regular basis, it will start to wear them away. Electrolytes imbalances are a big thing. You're constantly purging, be it through vomiting, diuretics, laxatives, whatever. You are ridding your body of fluids, and electrolytes get out of balance, and that can be very dangerous. That can result in cardiac arrest. Can result in seizures, can result in kidney failure, and all of those things can also result in death. There's a very high comorbidity of mood and anxiety disorders with bulimia nervosa. Depression is obviously a mood disorder, but it's often the onset of depression begins after the onset of the eating disorder. However, the anxiety typically precedes the eating disorder, interestingly enough. Anorexia is less common than bulimia, but people can ping pong back and forth between the two. So there are people who spend a time period starving themselves, and then they'll binge eat and purge for a time period and go back and forth and back and forth. However, there are some people who just stick to one or the other, right? Anorexics severely restrict caloric intake. Being anorexic doesn't necessarily mean that you eat absolutely nothing. You can eat and be anorexic, right? It's just you're eating such incredibly small quantities of food, such controlled small portions, that it's not enough to sustain your body's healthy function, and you start having all of this crazy weight loss, right? So a lot of people have that misnomer that, you never see an anorexic eat. Well, they will eat to some extent, but it will be extremely, extremely small and infrequent, right? Often you can tell, no matter, they restrict that caloric intake, oftentimes you'll see them eating the same food every single day, every single time they eat, right? Because that's the controlled calorie, right? They're never satisfied regardless of how much weight is lost, and they experience severe panic and distress when weight is gained, even if it's to the point where they're dangerously thin, dangerously underweight, and they have to gain weight in order to not die or to not have cardiac arrest. They feel excessive anxiety, right? So there are some anorexics, unfortunately, who get down to really severe, dangerous weight levels, like in the 80 pounds, and they're afraid, they're terrified of putting on weight, which they desperately need to do, right? Oftentimes, menstruation will discontinue with anorexic, although not always. They will have dry skin, brittle hair, brittle nails, sensitivity to cold because there's no body fat. Body fat is what keeps us warm. Right? They will often suffer from low blood pressure and low heart rate as a result of the fact that there's just nothing fueling their bodies, or there's something completely inadequate fueling their bodies. Anorexia nervosa has a high comorbidity with obsessive compulsive disorder, which should make some sense to you. That calorie counting, that need for control, the need, that feeling of that worry of spiraling out of control if I don't engage in this ritual of calorie counting. They're almost like cousins, right? Anorexia is almost like a cousin to obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So there's a high comorbidity between those two disorders. Like I said, eating disorders are dominated by women, and onset is typically in adolescence. However, males are on the rise for a couple of reasons. There's always an athletic population of males that partakes in anorexia because they have to maintain certain levels of weight, whether it's wrestling or professional athletes, especially in football, can't hit over a certain weight, so this is a method of weight control management. The gay and bisexual community has higher rates of anorexia than the straight male community. And one thing that both the straight and the gay community have in common among males in anorexia is that there is now, more so than ever in the past, there's greater body consciousness among the male population. Whereas for decades and centuries, the standards of beauty were heavily emphasized upon women. Now men are feeling more cultural pressure to, be muscular, look cut, have that stereotypical attractive male body, and therefore that's why we're seeing a rise in male eating disorders. This is very common in young girls, and there's a reason for this. Is with the onset of puberty, we see part of puberty is that there's a little bit of weight gain. We call it baby fat. Right? When puberty starts, young girls gain fatty tissue at the onset of puberty. This is totally normal, right? Completely normal, and it is typically shed at a later point in puberty, later on. So, around 5th, 6th grade, they start puberty, they get a little bit of that baby fat, and by 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, they probably will shed it. Usually they shed it. However, they feel intense pressure, shame, etc. from that biological change, so they start dieting at a very young age. Right, to try and get rid of that, even though it would go away all on its own anyway. We see that girls who start dieting in adolescence are notably more at risk for developing an eating disorder, right? And we get back to this idea of the cultural component. Thin is the definition of beauty in Western culture, right? And really, really thin in the past 2 decades is where the beauty standard has been. If you look back at, so for example, Marilyn Monroe is the epitome of beauty in the 1950s, and she's very curvy and she's very voluptuous, and she's got a shape to her. Versus fast forward to the 90s, when I was a young girl, the beauty expectation was Kate Moss, who's exceptionally thin naturally. Right? She doesn't have to diet to do that; it's just her genetic makeup. But she became the beauty ideal, and suddenly everybody wanted to have that beauty ideal. And most people are not genetically able to stay that thin. They're just not, right? So people started feeling the pressure that I am bigger than that, therefore I'm not beautiful. I want to be beautiful, so I'm going to lose weight to look like Kate Moss, right? So we've stayed, unfortunately, in our culture, we've stayed on that beauty ideal as really thin in the past couple of decades. Although I do feel like we're shifting away a little bit, right? That we're embracing a woman's curves and defining that as sexy and beautiful. So hopefully we'll see some minimization of this kind of pressure, this that we've seen in the last 2 decades. In addition, there's a cultural standard for beauty that is often unachievable. So I use Kate Moss as an example. Some people just are blessed with great genetics, they're blessed with great metabolisms, and it doesn't matter what they eat or whether they exercise or whatever, they're just gonna stay thin. Most people are not blessed with that, right? But the people who succeed in the entertainment industry, in the modeling industry and so forth, are often people who have that going for them. It's also often a lot of girls who don't have that going for them that engage in binging, purging, starving, etc. to take on that look to be a part of that world. The idea here being that what we promote in popular culture is an unsustainable and uncommon body standard. The Kate Mosses of the world are rare, very, very rare, but they are presented to us as though this is where we all should be if we want to be beautiful, when in fact it's just not possible. It's not sustainable. It's not achievable, right? Because that's just how her genetics function. Not so for everybody, and then it causes huge cultural problems with eating disorders. There's also a familial component to anorexia and eating disorders. Mothers with eating disorders will often end up having daughters with eating disorders, and that's environmental because they will restrict the food of their offspring. They will sort of harangue them about gaining weight and what are you eating and how often are you eating, and the negative behaviors and thought processes get adopted as well. There are even people, unfortunately, who will have a baby. Babies are supposed to be chubby and chunky. They need that baby fat, right? That's completely normal. It does not mean that they're fat. It doesn't mean that they're going to have a weight problem later on. It's just how babies are. But there are parents who will restrict caloric intake for babies because they're worried about that chunky baby fat staying forever. So there is a familial component about what parents' attitudes are and the rules they create around food and the culture they create around food in the household that can perpetuate the eating disorder problem. Also seems to carry a genetic component. So people with a family member that have an eating disorder are 5 times more likely to end up with an eating disorder. So it may be a personality trait that's heritable in some capacity. Whew, excuse me. Okay, so treatments. How do we treat people with eating disorders? Drug treatments have not seen a lot of success. So this is one of the few disorders that we do not treat with drugs because it doesn't really have a lot of success treating anorexia. However, drugs used to treat mood and anxiety disorders can have a positive impact on the subsequent eating disorder or not. Okay, it also has success with bulimia. We see that drugs that, psychopharmaceuticals that control anxiety, that control mood disorders, tend to have a minimizing impact on the binging, purging cycle. You have less of a desire to binge, and therefore there's less of a need to purge, and it just sort of minimizes it. So that has seen a little bit of success. We get back to our favorite therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, to change the thoughts about food and eating patterns and the way you relate to food and the way you behave with food in order to change the behavior. So if we change the way you think about it, that it's not the enemy, it's not going to destroy you or make you ugly, it's there to nourish you, it's there to make your body function, it's there to keep you healthy. Ultimately, the desire there is that if we can change that thinking, then we can change the way we engage with food. So we'll stop purging or we'll stop starving. Weight gain is not a good predictor of long-term effects. So there are people who are anorexic and bulimic, who are underweight, and they will gain weight in an attempt to get healthy. This does not mean once they gain weight, that's it, they're good to go, problem solved, not even close. This is often a lifelong struggle, and even people who get back to a healthy weight and breaks some of those bad relationships with food mentally and behaviorally spin back into the cycle. So that's not a good predictor of long-term health. Family-based therapy is highly suggested for people with anorexia. The entire family goes through therapy as a coping mechanism to gain an understanding on the situation and in order for the individual to have long-term recovery. That way the entire family is engaging in the individual's recovery, supportive recovery, recognizing problems, providing support and direction about keeping them on task with their relationship with food and so forth. So far, group family-based therapy is the most successful form of therapy treating anorexia. Let's switch gears to sleeping and waking disorders. We study this because sleep is controlled by the brain, obviously. It is controlled in the limbic system, which interestingly enough is also where we see problems with anxiety. The limbic system controls our sleep cycles, our circadian rhythms. But if you have problems with anxiety, you often have problems sleeping, right? So if you've ever had anxiety, I just spent the whole night not sleeping. Oh, excuse me, because they're located in the same brain center. They function in the same part of the brain center. So there's 2 categories of sleeping and waking disorders. First is the dysomnias, and these are problems getting to sleep or in obtaining an efficient quality of sleep. The parasomnias are sleeping disorders that have abnormal behaviors or physiological events like sleepwalking or sleep talking, nightmares, etc. People who have sleep disorders need to undergo evaluation to see what's going on while they're sleeping. There's a couple of ways that we can be evaluated during our sleep to see what's happening with brain function. The first is a polysomnographic evaluation, and that is you go to a lab, you'll sleep in the lab, and they'll hook all kinds of stuff up to you, and while you sleep, they'll see what's going on with your heart, what's going on with your muscles, what's going on with your respiration. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? What's happening with the brain waves? Are they slowing down because they should be? You're at rest, or are they not? So they'll see what's going on. Are there abnormalities there? One of the things that we want to focus on is sleep efficiency when people go in for an evaluation. So when you are sleeping, how much actual time are you sleeping versus just lying in bed with your eyes closed? Lying in bed with your eyes closed isn't rest. I mean, it's rest and it's necessary, but it's not the physical sleeping rest that we need for our body to repair itself every single day and our minds to repair itself. I want to tell you about insomnia disorder. This is a condition characterized by insufficient sleep that interferes with normal function. People who have this can't get to sleep, or if they get to sleep, they can't stay asleep without any sort of medical explanation. So there's nothing physically causing the insomnia, but it's there, and it's really inhibiting their ability to go to work, get up, function, clean the house, take care of the kids, whatever. Rebound insomnia occurs when insomnia, and this is where treating insomnia gets really dicey. This occurs when insomnia is treated with a medication. The medication doesn't have the desired effect, so it doesn't help. Right? You go off the medication, and what happens is the insomnia actually gets worse. So you take the medication to try and minimize the insomnia. It does not help you to get to sleep. It does not help you to rest. So you stop taking it because it's not working. And what you find is now your symptoms are worse than they were before you originally took the medication. So we call that rebound insomnia. Right? I want to talk about hypersomnolence disorders. This is sleep dysfunction involving excessive amounts of sleep. So it's the opposite of insomnia. Excessive amounts of sleep that disrupts a person's normal routine and ability to function. So rather than a good 7 to 9 hours of sleep, people are sleeping 11, 12, 13 hours, and they're so tired they literally cannot function. This is often treated with medications. However, people can become dependent on those medications. And the problem with medications is they're meant to be short-term. It's not meant to be something you take for the rest of your life. So if you don't see an improvement while you're on that short-term medical stint, often you just get right back to the place you were before you started it, right? Okay, other sleep disorders. Sleep apnea. This is a disorder involving brief periods of time when the breathing stops while you're sleeping. If you've ever witnessed somebody with sleep apnea, it can be kind of disturbing because they literally stop breathing and you just sort of stare waiting like, are you gonna start breathing? Right? And then they'll stop. There'll be a period of time when they don't breathe, and usually when the air starts going back in, they have like a like really loud sort of startling noise. Why is this a problem? Aside from the fact that you're not breathing, is that it disrupts sleep patterns. Every time you stop breathing, there's a disruption in your sleep patterns. So even though you are in fact asleep and you're not consciously awake, you're not getting rest. Every single time that your breathing stops, it disrupts your sleeping pattern. So you sleep the whole night and you wake up exhausted, right? And it inhibits function. Right. This is treated with the CPAP machine, and it's treated pretty successfully with the CPAP. The CPAP machine is a plastic mask where it goes over the nose and the mouth. It's held on by like, I don't know, stretchy things. And there's a tube that feeds air in constantly so that when the person stops breathing, they don't stop breathing because air is forced in and it continues the breathing process, therefore not interrupting their sleeping process. And they get the rest that they need. They get the actual rest that they need. However, some people are really hesitant to use this because they don't like the mask. They can't sleep comfortably with it on. It's inhibiting. Some people feel very claustrophobic about it, that there's this thing on my face, it's covering my nose, it's covering my mouth. It makes me panic or feel like, I'm being trapped, and they just don't want to wear it. So CPAP is really, really successful for the people who can tolerate it, but there's a lot of people who wouldn't even give it a shot, or who have given it a shot and they're just like, this is just not working for me. Narcolepsy is another sleep disorder, and this is characterized by sudden sleep attacks that cannot be avoided. It's the strangest thing. People are wide awake 1 second, and instantaneously in the next second, they are in deep sleep. There's no slow progression of falling asleep. There's no awareness that I'm going from consciousness to unconsciousness. It just happens. It happens very quickly, and obviously that's incredibly debilitating. That can result in a lot of danger. You can't be driving down the road if you have narcolepsy, and boom, you're out behind the wheel, right? So that's a really, really serious disorder. In addition to those characteristics, people with narcolepsy often experience other sleep issues. The first is sleep paralysis. When we sleep, our body secretes a hormone that keeps us from moving. It literally is done so that we don't physically enact our dreams. There are some people who don't get enough of this hormone, and they do physically enact their dreams, and these people flail about and make gestures, and they talk, and they often sleepwalk. But People with narcolepsy and some people with who don't have narcolepsy get sleep paralysis, and that's when they secrete too much of that hormone. When they wake up, there's still too much of the hormone in their system, and they find, I am completely awake and I cannot move. I can't get up, I can't leave the bed, I can't move my arms, I can't move my legs, and it takes a little bit of time. Not long in the grand scheme of things. I mean, we're not talking like 20 or 30 minutes or anything like that. But for people who experience this upon waking, that I can't move, it's incredibly alarming and it's very, very scary. So it might take 30 to 90 seconds before they can get up and get about and get moving. But that's pretty terrifying for those people who experience that. Narcoleptics also experience hypnagogic hallucinations, often in tandem with sleep paralysis. Hypnagogic hallucinations are where they hear, see, and feel people and or things that simply are not there. They're simply hallucinations. But they look, sound, and feel real as everything and everyone else in the room. Imagine waking up in a state of sleep paralysis and you feel the presence of somebody in the room, you can see their shadow, you can hear them whispering, and you can't move, right? That's got to be pretty terrifying because you've got sleep paralysis and you're suffering from the hypnagogic hallucinations. So this causes a lot of trouble, obviously, for people who suffer from these. And people with narcolepsy tend to have higher rates of sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations. Next is circadian rhythm sleep disorder. This is a sleep disturbance that results in excessive sleepiness or insomnia. So it's sort of both ends, right? Either I'm really, really tired or I can't sleep at all, right? And this is because their body can't synchronize their circadian rhythms. Our circadian rhythms are our patterns, the way our body syncs with patterns of day and night, where there's sunlight, when there's not. Our bodies are telling ourselves, okay, it's dark out, it's time to get sleepy, tired, go to bed. But some people work odd hours, right? They work that night shift, and their circadian rhythms get all out of whack because that's just the nature of the schedules that they keep. And therefore, they bounce back and forth between being excessively sleepy or not being able to sleep at all because they have to get those circadian rhythms back in order. The next is night terrors. Night terrors are really scary for the people who are watching them. Not really scary for the people having them, interestingly enough. When somebody has a night terror, they appear awake, they might speak, they might have their eyes open, they're often moving, right? And they appear to be experiencing extreme fear, extreme panic. They look like they're having a freak out. They might yell, they might scream, they might, show distress, noteworthy, disorientation. But they're not awake. That's the thing that's really strange. They're not awake, and it's impossible to wake somebody who's having a night terror. So if you have a family member and they're in the middle of a night terror and you go and you see that they're really in massive distress and you're trying to wake them so that they can, be okay, you can't wake them. The night terror simply has to run its course. However, on the positive end for them, when they wake up, they never have any memory of the night terrors, right? So it's a strange sort of thing. You have to let the night terror run its course. The final one is sleepwalking. Sleepwalking. There's a distinction here between sleepwalking, what constitutes sleepwalking. In order to have the problem of sleepwalking, you literally have to physically leave your bed, okay, and walk around in a full state of sleep. There are some people that are sort of gray area. They're not all the way to sleepwalking, but they don't sleep without disturbance either. My husband is one of these people. I'm very familiar with this. He does not walk. He doesn't get out of bed. He does, however, he'll sit straight up. People who have this, they'll sit straight up. He will speak as though he's wide awake. He will make gestures. He will move things. He will do all sorts of movements that are disturbing, and they wake me up. Right? And then he wakes up. There's a moment of disorientation, and he falls back asleep. The next day, he may or may not remember those events, right? Again, this can be disturbing for a number of reasons. Primarily for the person sharing your bed. They don't get a lot of sleep when this happens. But certainly for people who sleepwalk and actually leave the bed, it can be very dangerous, right? Falling downstairs, accidentally leaving the house while you're not in a conscious state, etc. So there are issues there that need to be dealt with to make sure that everybody's safe with their sleeping disorders. And that's it for Chapter 8.